The text came at 12:03 a.m. 4 words. We're letting you go. No warning, no meeting. Just pixels on a screen ending 22 years of my life. They didn't know I designed the foundation their entire company was built on. Every line of code, every security protocol, every data pipeline, I'd written them all. And I never leave quietly. By morning, they'd understand exactly what they'd lost. Not through destruction or revenge, but through the simple, elegant silence of a system that suddenly forgot how to breathe without its creator. I'm Madeline Hart, and until 3 minutes ago, I was the chief systems architect at Omnidata Systems. 22 years of building their empire from scratch. And they ended it with a text message. I stared at my phone, the blue light harsh against the darkness of my home office. The sender was Janet from HR, a woman who couldn't configure her email signature without calling IT. The timestamp mocked me. 12:03 a.m., like they'd scheduled it to arrive the moment my employment technically ended. My laptop was still open, displaying the architecture diagram I'd been reviewing. Government contracts worth $2.8 billion flowed through systems I'd designed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd just fixed a critical vulnerability in their authentication framework 6 hours ago. My last gift to them, apparently. The house was silent except for the hum of servers in my basement lab. Denver's skyline glittered through the window, indifferent to my sudden unemployment. I'd chosen this house specifically for its view of downtown, where Omnidata's gleaming tower stood like a monument to everything I'd helped build. I pulled up my corporate email, already deactivated, of course, but they'd made their first mistake. My development access was still active, sloppy, but typical of the new management. Grant Elway, our recently appointed CEO, believed in moving fast and breaking things. He was about to learn what breaking really meant. 22 years. I'd started when Omnidata was 5 people in a converted warehouse, writing code on computers held together with duct tape and hope. I'd architected their first database when we won the Colorado state contract. I'd built the encryption protocols that got us federal clearance. I created the framework that processed classified data for 3-letter agencies whose names I couldn't even mention at dinner parties. And they'd ended it with 4 words and a period. My hands were steady as I reached for my coffee, cold now, forgotten during my evening code review. The anger would come later. Right now, there was only a crystalline clarity, the kind that comes when you realize you've been played by people you'd trusted. The new leadership had been circling for months, young MBAs who spoke in buzzwords and measured success in quarterly earnings. They saw me as expensive legacy code, functional but replaceable. They'd been bringing in consultants, fresh graduates who nodded at everything and questioned nothing. I'd watch them study my systems like archaeologists examining hieroglyphics, pretending they understood the logic beneath. They didn't. They couldn't. Because I'd built these systems not just to function, but to remember their creator. Every authentication protocol, every data pipeline, every critical process bore my fingerprints in ways they'd never bothered to document. I smiled for the first time since reading the message. They thought they were letting me go. They had no idea what they'd just set in motion. The woman behind Omnidata's system wasn't always invisible. There was a time when everyone knew my name. I remember my first day in 2003, walking into that warehouse on Wincoop Street. 5 people, 6 computers, and a dream of revolutionizing government data management. Tom Morrison, the original founder, had hired me straight from MIT based on a single conversation about distributed systems. "You think like a computer but dream like an architect," he'd said. I was 21 and believed I could change the world with elegant code. The first framework I built is still running today. They call it the Morrison Protocol now. Tom insisted on naming it after himself before he sold his shares in 2015. But every function, every method, every line was mine. I'd worked 18-hour days, surviving on energy drinks and the thrill of solving impossible problems. When we landed our first federal contract, I was the one who built the security architecture that passed Pentagon inspection. I became their secret weapon. While the sales team pitched and the executives strategized, I built. layer upon layer of interconnected systems, each one more sophisticated than the last. The data lake that processed millions of transactions daily. Mine. The AI pipeline that predicted security threats before they materialized. I wrote the first algorithm on a napkin during a Christmas party. The authentication system that had never been breached in 2 decades. I'd designed it after a nightmare about hackers. But I wasn't just building code, I was building a fortress, and I was the only one who knew where all the doors were hidden. By 2010, companies started courting me. Google offered triple my salary. NASA wanted me for their Mars mission data systems. A startup backed by Musk's people promised equity that would make me rich beyond imagination. I turned them all down. Tom had made me believe in Omnidata's mission, securing America's digital infrastructure. I was naive enough to think loyalty mattered. Tom retired 5 years ago, selling his shares to a private equity firm. That's when the erosion began. The new board brought in consultants who spoke about optimization and redundancy elimination. They hired Grant Elway as CEO, a man who'd never written a line of code but had an MBA from Wharton and a talent for corporate doublespeak. The first sign of trouble came last year. Grant started excluding me from architecture meetings, saying they needed fresh perspectives. Fresh perspectives turned out to be kids straight from boot camps who thought JavaScript was the answer to everything. I watched them propose rebuilding systems that had run flawlessly for decades, not understanding that stability was a feature, not a bug. Then came the contract negotiations. When Omnidata landed the DoD's Project Cerberus, a $500 million deal, my name wasn't on the credits. 20 years of building the infrastructure that made the bid possible. And I was listed as additional technical support. Grant explained it as a strategic decision to highlight our young talent. I started documenting everything after that. Every design decision, every piece of code, every system I'd built. Not in the company repositories. Those could be edited, deleted, rewritten. I kept to my own records, encrypted and stored where only I could access them. Call it paranoia. But I'd learned that in tech, your creations could be stolen as easily as your parking spot. 3 months ago, they hired my replacement without telling me. Sarah Kim, a digital transformation specialist from Amazon. She shadowed me for weeks, asking questions about systems she pretended to understand. I answered honestly. I still believed in the work, even if I no longer believed in the company. I showed her the architecture, explained the logic, shared the documentation I'd written. What I didn't share were the subtle dependencies I'd built into the core systems. Not malicious code, I'm not a criminal, but design patterns that required deep understanding to maintain. Like a master chef who doesn't write down the exact moment to add salt. I'd built systems that needed intuition as much as documentation. Last week, I overheard Sarah telling Grant that she'd fully mapped Hart's legacy systems. They were ready to move forward without me. The expensive dinosaur could be retired. They thought 22 years of institutional knowledge could be transferred in 3 months of shadowing. They thought systems were just code, not living organisms that evolved with their creator. They thought I was replaceable. As I sat in my home office at 12:47 a.m., unemployed for the first time since college, I realized they'd made a fundamental error. They'd forgotten that I wasn't just an employee. I was the memory of every system they relied on. And memories, when betrayed, have a way of fading exactly when you need them most. What they forgot to delete would become their most expensive oversight. I opened my laptop at 1:15 a.m., muscle memory, guiding my fingers to the development environment. The staging server, my personal testing sandbox that I'd maintained for 15 years, welcomed me like an old friend. They'd revoked my corporate email, locked my main accounts. But this forgotten corner of their infrastructure remained untouched. Typical of Grant's management style, all show, no substance. The irony was perfect, 6 months ago. I'd submitted a security audit highlighting this exact vulnerability. Legacy access points need immediate review. I'd written. Grant's response had been to schedule a meeting that never happened, then forward my report to Sarah with a note. Low priority. Hart's being overly cautious as usual. Now, sitting in my home office with termination still fresh, I logged into the system I'd built, and they'd ignored. No malicious intent, just a final look at 2 decades of work. The terminal welcomed me with familiar green text on black background. My fingers found their rhythm, commands flowing like poetry. First, I navigated to the audit logs. Every action in Omnidata's ecosystem left a trace here. A breadcrumb trail I'd insisted on after we'd nearly lost a contract due to undocumented changes. The logs told stories, who accessed what, when, and why. I exported them all, 22 years of digital history, compressed and encrypted. Next, the architectural documentation. Not the sanitized versions in the corporate wiki, but the real blueprints. The ones that showed every connection, every dependency, every critical path. Sarah might have my official documentation, but she didn't have the margin notes, the warnings, the never touch this unless comments I'd kept in my personal directories. Then I found something that made me pause. In the licensing directory, buried under layers of legal boilerplate, were the original framework agreements. My name was on everyone, listed as co-creator with intellectual property rights in perpetuity. Tom and I had insisted on it back when Omnidata was just a dream. The lawyers had said we were being paranoid. Tom had laughed and said paranoia was just another word for experience. But the real discovery came when I accessed the contracts directory. There, in a folder marked Strategic Partnerships 2024, I found the documents that made my blood run cold. Omnidata was selling my systems, not just using them, but packaging and selling them to third parties. The Morrison Protocol, my authentication framework, the entire data pipeline architecture, all being licensed to competitors without my knowledge or consent. Grant had turned my life's work into a product catalog, and my name appeared nowhere in the deals. I downloaded everything, not to destroy or sabotage, that would be beneath me and legally dangerous, but to preserve evidence of what they'd built their empire on. Every system, every protocol, every innovation they were now selling bore my digital DNA. As I worked, I noticed something else in the system logs. Sarah Kim had been accessing my personal development environment for weeks, copying code segments and documentation. But her queries showed a pattern of someone who didn't understand what she was stealing. She'd copied functions without their dependencies, grabbed modules without their configuration files, like someone photocopying a recipe without understanding what fold gently meant. At 2:47 a.m., I came across a directory I'd almost forgotten about, Dead Switch Development, a proof of concept I'd created 5 years ago during a particularly paranoid phase after a competitor had tried to poach our entire development team. The idea was simple, a system state that would activate under specific conditions, freezing operations until proper authentication was provided. I'd never implemented it in production. Tom had talked me out of it, saying it was too much power for any one person. But the code was still there, elegant in its simplicity. Not malicious, it wouldn't delete or corrupt anything. It would simply pause. Like a conductor stopping an orchestra mid-symphony, waiting for the right cue to continue. The timestamp on the directory showed someone had accessed it recently. Sarah Kim, 3 days ago. She'd opened it, probably trying to understand another piece of my code. But the access log showed she'd spent less than 30 seconds before moving on. Another artifact of the past, irrelevant to her modern sensibilities. I smiled, remembering why I designed it. The dead switch wasn't about destruction, it was about recognition. A system acknowledging its creator, waiting for the right hand to guide it forward. I'd built it into the framework level, so deep in the architecture that removing it would require rebuilding everything from scratch. They'd forgotten to delete my access, but more importantly, they'd forgotten that creation and creator were inseparable. Every system they relied on carried pieces of me, waiting patiently in the code like seeds in winter soil. At 3 a.m., I closed my laptop. I had what I needed, evidence, documentation, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing they'd made a fatal assumption. They thought they owned what I'd built. They were about to learn the difference between possession and understanding. Silent keyboard, loud consequences. That became my mantra as I prepared for what needed to be done. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my basement lab, surrounded by the servers I used for personal projects, and thought about elegant solutions. Destruction was easy. Any script kiddie could write malware. But I was Madeline Hart, and I'd spent 22 years building things that lasted. My response would be architectural, not destructive. The dead switch wasn't malicious code, it was a state management system. Think of it like a building security system that locks down during unauthorized access. Except this one recognized ownership at the code level. I'd designed it to detect when critical systems were being accessed or modified by unauthorized personnel, particularly when ownership credentials didn't match the original architect's signature. At 4 a.m., I opened my development environment one last time. The code was already there, woven into the framework 5 years ago, dormant but functional. All it needed was activation. A simple configuration change that would tell the system to start checking ownership signatures. I modified the authentication parameters. If the system detected access from Grant Elway's credentials or any attempt to transfer ownership without proper authorization, it would initiate a cascade of logical checks. Each check would require validation from the original architect's device, my personal development laptop, with its unique hardware signature that I'd embedded in the code years ago. The beauty was in its simplicity. No deleted files, no corrupted data, no cyber attack that could be traced or prosecuted. The system would simply enter an offline logic state, a suspended animation where all functions would pause, waiting for the right key to continue. Like a piano that suddenly forgot how to make sound until the original tuner returned. I tested it first on my local mirror of their staging environment. The code executed flawlessly. When I tried accessing it with simulated CEO credentials, the system politely declined and requested architect validation. Every service went dark, not crashed, not broken, just waiting. The implementation took 3 hours, line by line. I activated dormant code that had been sitting in their production systems for half a decade. It was like flipping switches in a house I'd wired myself. I knew exactly where each breaker was located. By 5:30 a.m., as Denver's skyline began to lighten with pre-dawn gray, I made my final modification. The dead switch would activate on a timer, 6 hours from my last legitimate login. That gave them until 11 a.m. to realize their mistake and reach out. If they did, I could stop it. If they didn't, they'd learn what happened when you fired the architect while still living in her building. I added one last touch, a message that would display when they tried to access the locked systems. Architectural validation required. Please contact original system designer. No name, no threats, just a simple statement of fact. As I closed my laptop for the final time, I thought about Sarah Kim, probably sleeping soundly, confident that she'd absorbed everything she needed to know. She'd copied my code, studied my documentation, attended my meetings. But she'd never understood the fundamental truth of complex systems. They're not just logic and functions. They're relationships, built over time, between creator and creation. I made coffee and sat on my deck, watching the sun rise over the Rockies. My phone was silent, no panic yet. They wouldn't discover anything until the East Coast government clients started their day and found their dashboards dark. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 2 decades making sure Omnidata's systems never went down. I'd sacrificed weekends, holidays, and relationships to maintain 99.99% uptime. I'd built redundancies for their redundancies, backup systems for their backup systems. I'd made them invincible. But I'd also made them dependent. Every strength, when reversed, becomes a weakness. Their perfect uptime record meant they'd never developed proper crisis protocols. Their trust in my systems meant they'd never truly understood them. Their faith in stability meant they'd forgotten that all things, eventually, must change. At 7 a.m., I received an automated email to my personal account, the last vestige of my access, confirming that all staging environment connections had been terminated. They were finally closing the barn door. Too late. I dressed carefully, business casual. Nothing that suggested crisis or concern. If anyone was watching, they'd see a recently terminated employee starting her job search. I updated my LinkedIn, reached out to a few contacts, even scheduled a lunch with a former colleague at Microsoft. But I kept my phone close, waiting for the inevitable call. They'd try IT first, then security, then legal. Only when all those failed would they realize what they needed, not a hacker or a lawyer, but an architect. The keyboard was silent now, but the consequences were already spreading through their systems like a perfectly timed symphony, each note falling exactly where I'd written it to fall. Dark by morning, exactly as I'd predicted. My phone erupted at 6:15 a.m. with notifications from LinkedIn. Former colleagues at Omnidata were updating their statuses with carefully worded panic. Experiencing technical difficulties. Working on system issues. Bear with us during maintenance. The corporate speak couldn't hide their terror. I opened my laptop to monitor tech news feeds. By 6:47 a.m., the first reports appeared on government contractor forums. Anyone else having issues with Omnidata systems? Within minutes, the thread exploded. 11 major clients reported complete system failures, not errors, not slowdowns, but polite messages requesting architectural validation. At 7:30 a.m., my former colleague Jake Morrison, no relation to Tom, texted me. "Mad, please tell me you didn't do something stupid." I responded honestly. I didn't do anything. I stopped doing something. The distinction mattered. I hadn't attacked their systems or planted malware. I'd simply activated code that had always been there. Waiting. Code they'd approved, reviewed, and deployed 5 years ago without understanding its purpose. By 8 a.m., I could picture the war room at Omnidata's headquarters. The NOC would be in full crisis mode, engineers staring at dashboards that politely refused their credentials. Sarah Kim would be frantically searching through my documentation, looking for answers in copied files that assumed knowledge she didn't possess. The beauty of the dead switch was its politeness. Every error message was helpful, even friendly. System requires architectural validation. Please authenticate with original designer credentials. No data was lost, no processes corrupted. The systems had simply decided to take a break, like union workers honoring a picket line. At 8:45 a.m., the calls started. First, a junior developer I'd mentored, voice shaking. "Madeline, we need your help. Everything's locked." "I'm no longer an Omnidata employee," I reminded him gently. I was terminated at midnight. Next came the VP of Engineering, a man who'd once called my security protocols overkill. His tone mixed desperation with barely concealed rage. "What did you do to our systems?" "Nothing," I said truthfully. "Your systems are operating exactly as designed. The dead switch protocol was implemented in 2019 with full approval from the technical board. Check the documentation." He hung up when I suggested they hire me as a consultant at 5 times my previous rate. By 10 a.m., the situation had escalated beyond technical forums. TechCrunch picked up the story. Major government contractor experiences nationwide outage. The article speculated about cyber attacks, ransomware, foreign interference. If only they knew the truth was far simpler. A creator reclaiming recognition of her creation. At 10:30 a.m., Janet from HR called. The same woman who'd sent the midnight termination text now spoke with syrupy concern. "Madeline, there seems to be some confusion about your separation. Would you be available to discuss transition assistance?" "I'm not confused at all," I told her. "I have your text message saved, very clear." The Pentagon called at 11 a.m. Not Omnidata, the actual Pentagon. A colonel with steel in his voice. "Ms. Hart, we need to discuss the situation with critical defense infrastructure. With respect, Colonel, I'm a private citizen who was terminated without cause. If you have concerns about Omnidata's ability to maintain their contracts, I suggest you speak with CEO Grant Elway." The colonel's voice softened slightly. "Off the record, Ms. Hart, we've been concerned about Omnidata's technical leadership changes. Your name came up frequently as the only reason we maintained confidence in their systems." I gave him my consulting rates and suggested he pass them along to Grant. By noon, Omnidata's stock had dropped 12%. The financial news channels were calling it the dark morning, though they still didn't understand why. Analysts speculated about everything from Russian hackers to internal sabotage, never guessing the truth that the systems had simply gone quiet, waiting for their architect to return. At 12:30 p.m., my doorbell rang. Through the security camera, I saw Grant Elway himself, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 12 hours. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man who'd just learned the difference between owning something and understanding it. I let him stand there for 5 minutes before answering. When I opened the door, he started to speak, but I held up my hand. Before you say anything, Grant, understand this. I didn't break your systems. They're working perfectly, exactly as designed. They're just waiting for proper authentication. His jaw clenched. How do we fix this? You don't, I said simply. I do. But first, we need to discuss terms. The morning had gone dark, just as I'd known it would, not with violence or destruction, but with the simple absence of someone they'd taken for granted. Every government system that relied on Omnidata was learning what I'd always known, that no system is stronger than the knowledge of its creator. And they'd sent that knowledge away with a 4-word text at midnight. My terms, my code, my legacy. I made sure Grant understood each word as he stood in my doorway. You want consultant rates? Grant's voice cracked with exhaustion and barely suppressed rage. Fine. Name your price. I smiled, the kind of smile I'd perfected during 22 years of being underestimated. I don't want your money, Grant. Well, not just your money. I invited him in, letting him sit in my living room where photos from Omnidata's early days lined the walls. Tom Morrison and I grinning at our first successful deployment, the original team celebrating our first $1 million contract. History he'd tried to erase with a midnight text. Let me explain something, I began, pouring myself coffee without offering him any. The systems aren't broken. They're in protective custody. The dead switch protocol recognizes when ownership is being transferred without proper authorization. It's working exactly as designed. This is extortion, he spat. No, it's intellectual property law. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared at 4 a.m., slides of legal documents ready. Every core system at Omnidata contains code I developed with retained rights. The framework agreements from 2003 clearly state that any derivative work requires my explicit consent for transfer or sale. I showed him the contracts he'd signed with third parties, selling my systems without attribution or authorization. His face went from red to white as he realized the implications. Furthermore, I continued, enjoying his discomfort. I have documentation showing Sarah Kim accessed and copied proprietary code from my personal development environment without permission. That's corporate espionage, Grant. You can't prove. I have everything, I interrupted. 22 years of audit logs, including some very interesting entries from the last 6 months, like how you instructed the team to reverse engineer hard systems to eliminate dependencies, or how you told investors you'd modernized away from legacy constraints. The silence stretched between us. Outside, Denver's afternoon sun cast long shadows, reminding me of all the late nights I'd spent building what he'd tried to steal. What do you want? He finally asked. I handed him a single-page document. My terms, clear and non-negotiable. First, official recognition as co-architect of all Omnidata systems. Retroactive to founding date. Not buried in technical credits, featured in all corporate communications, contracts, and documentation. Second, full settlement of my original employment agreement, including the equity options that mysteriously vanished during the 2018 restructuring. At current valuation, not the penny stock price from when I'd earned them. Third, licensing fees for any third-party sales of systems I'd architected. Industry standard rates, retroactive to the first unauthorized sale. Fourth, a public statement acknowledging my contributions to Omnidata's success and clarifying that my departure was a strategic error. This is insane, Grant said, but his voice lacked conviction. No, Insane was thinking you could build $1 billion company on someone else's work and then discard them like obsolete hardware. I pulled up my phone, showing him the real-time dashboard I'd built years ago. Every government system was still patiently waiting, displaying the same polite message. The Pentagon called me, I added casually. They're very interested in understanding why their critical infrastructure depends on a company that fires its architects. The colonel mentioned something about contract reviews. Grant's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and paled further. Board members, no doubt. You have a choice, I said. Accept my terms, and I'll authenticate the systems within an hour. Everything goes back to normal. Your stock recovers, and you keep your government contracts. Or refuse, and explain to shareholders why you decided to play hardball with the person who literally holds the keys. If we agree, he said slowly, what guarantee do we have that you won't do this again? The same guarantee you had for 22 years, my professional integrity. The difference is, now you'll remember to value it. He made several calls, each one more heated than the last. Legal, the board, probably his PR team. I waited patiently, sipping my coffee and watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Time was on my side. Every minute of downtime cost them hundreds of thousands in SLA penalties. At 3:47 p.m., he finally spoke. The board agrees to your terms, pending legal review. No, I said firmly. Full agreement now, or I start returning Pentagon calls. Your legal team can review after the systems are back online. His jaw clenched, but he nodded. We spent the next hour with lawyers on speakerphone, drafting agreements that recognized what should have been acknowledged decades ago. My name restored to every system I'd built. My contributions written into Omnidata's official history. My rights respected and compensated. By 5 p.m. Grant Elway signed his name to documents that made me, retroactively, one of Omnidata's founding architects. The woman they'd tried to erase at midnight was now permanently etched into their corporate DNA. Now, he said, exhausted and defeated. Will you fix this? I smiled. I was never broken, Grant. I was just waiting for you to remember who built your empire. Power doesn't disappear. It just goes dark until someone remembers to flip the switch. I opened my laptop one final time. Grant Elway watching from across my living room like a defeated general witnessing surrender terms. The authentication process was simple. A few keystrokes, a biometric scan, and 22 years of muscle memory guiding my fingers across the keyboard. Initiating architectural validation, I said aloud, more for his benefit than mine. The screens flickered to life, showing system after system coming back online, like a city recovering from a blackout. Omnidata's infrastructure awakened piece by piece, each component recognizing its architect's touch. Within minutes, green lights cascaded across the status dashboard. Government clients would see their systems restored, data intact, operations resuming as if nothing had happened. The only evidence of the day's events would be in audit logs that told a story of recognition finally given where it was due. Grant's phone exploded with notifications, relief from the board, gratitude from clients, confusion from staff who'd spent 12 hours failing to fix what I'd resolved in 12 seconds. He looked older, humbled by the realization that power in the digital age wasn't about corner offices or org charts. It was about understanding the systems we'd become dependent on. Is that it? He asked, voice hollow. Almost. I pulled up one last screen, my access management panel. With deliberate keystrokes, I revoked my own permissions, deleted my development environment access, and severed the last digital threads connecting me to Omnidata's systems. Now it's done. He stood to leave, then paused at my door. The board wants to discuss a permanent consulting arrangement. Your terms, of course. I'll think about it, I said, though we both knew I'd decline. Some bridges, once burned at midnight, couldn't be rebuilt with morning apologies. After he left, I sat in the gathering dusk, laptop closed for good. My phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues, tech journalists, even competitors who'd heard about the day's events through Silicon Valley's efficient gossip network. I ignored them all. Sarah Kim called at 7 p.m., her voice small and uncertain. Madeline, I wanted to apologize. I didn't know about the contracts, the rights, any of it. Grant told me you were holding the company back. Sarah, I said, not unkindly. You're a good engineer, but being good isn't enough when you're standing on someone else's foundation. Learn to build your own. She thanked me for the lesson, though I doubted she fully understood it yet. Understanding would come with time, with her own creations, with her own midnight betrayals. By evening, the tech world was buzzing with the story. Not the full truth. Grant's PR team made sure of that, but enough. Founding architect returns to resolve critical infrastructure issue. Omnidata recognizes historical contributions of key technologist. Corporate speak that danced around the real story. They tried to steal what they couldn't understand and nearly destroyed themselves in the process. I received a package at 9 p.m., delivered by courier. Inside, a single item. The original Omnidata keycard from 2003, the one Tom Morrison had handed me on my first day. A note in Grant's handwriting. The board thought you should have this. Some keys, apparently, shouldn't be thrown away. I held the old keycard, remembering the young woman who'd believed she could change the world with elegant code. She had, in ways she'd never imagined. Not through the systems she'd built, but through the lesson she'd taught. That every line of code carries its creator's signature. Every system remembers its architect, and power doesn't disappear. It just waits in the dark for someone to remember its source. I placed the keycard on my bookshelf, between a photo of the original team and my MIT diploma. Tomorrow, I'd start returning calls from companies who'd suddenly remembered the value of architects who understood their own creations. But tonight, I'd simply enjoy the quiet satisfaction of a system restored, a legacy recognized, and the knowledge that somewhere in Denver, a CEO was learning the difference between owning code and understanding it. They'd fired me at midnight, thinking they were cutting costs. By morning, they'd learned the price of forgetting who kept the lights on. The darkness had been temporary, but the lesson would last forever. Every line of code has memory. Every system knows its creator. And I am the memory they tried to delete, the knowledge they couldn't replicate, the architect they'll never forget again. Thank you for listening to this story of corporate revenge and digital justice. Where are you listening from? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something similar in your workplace? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share your own stories of standing up for what's rightfully yours.